Thanks for listening to this special post-season interview episode of Melting into Air. Our second season will premiere in fall 2026. If you'd like to support the show, please rate and review us on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive content, including a Season 1 Q&A episode and bonus material from this interview, in which today's guest shares her thoughts on the connections between Wuthering Heights, the romance novel industry, and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. For more information about today's material, please visit our website at meltingintoair.net. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy the episode. Since 1847, Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights has captivated readers with its searing story of destructive love, obsessive hatred, and devotion that transcends the grave. Set amid the lonely moors of northern England, the novel follows the sadistic Heathcliff and the untamable Catherine, whose passion for each other spirals into violence that consumes two families. Many Victorians found the story shocking. Hollywood has found it endlessly appealing. Wuthering Heights has been adapted for the screen dozens of times over the past 100 years. But what gets lost when translating a 19th-century novel to the screen? Why has pop culture often misremembered Bronte's narrative? And how exactly does that narrative continue to inform young people's expectations of romantic love? Today, I'm joined by an expert who also happens to be my good friend and former graduate school classmate. Dr. Kristin Rose teaches at Vanderbilt University, where she is a senior lecturer in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies and affiliated faculty for the Climate and Environmental Studies program. Her 2023 dissertation, Women on the Wastes, explores how some of the Victorian era's most prolific women writers used the imaginatively charged landscapes of the waste or wasteland to reimagine narratives of development beyond expropriative notions of British progress. In addition to 19th century studies, her teaching and research interests include ecofeminism, climate fiction, and queer literature. Her articles have recently appeared in the Keats Shelley Journal and Novel, a forum on fiction. Thanks for coming on our show, Kristin.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
So, how did you first become interested in Victorian studies?
I have loved at least period pieces in historical fiction since I was a child. But I feel that my kind of villain origin story with Victorian literature is kind of a cliche in that when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, I first read Pride and Prejudice. Not Victorian, but the onset of loving the 19th century and loving these famous female authors. And that came alongside the 2005 Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice film, which is still my comfort film and is one of my favorite movies ever. And from then, I just started reading and didn't stop. So starting age 12, going into high school, it was the Brontes. And then it was honestly all the Russians. It was Dostoevsky, it was Tolstoy. And then leading into college, it was natural that I was in an English and Russian double major because I loved 19th century Russian literature so much. I then specialized in 19th century British literature at the same time. So it was kind of like a back and forth between my two loves of these nations and that era of writing.
So let's talk about Emily Brontë. We actually, just by coincidence, happened to be recording this on her 208th birthday, July 30th, 2026.
Amazing!
So tell us a little bit about who Emily Brontë was, and tell us about her book, Wuthering Heights.
So first of all, just to paint you a picture of this amazing person, she's one of 6 children growing up in the Yorkshire moors. Her father and mother, you've got Patrick and Mariah Brontë. They have 2 daughters, Mariah and Elizabeth, who will die when they're really young, so age 11 and 10, I think. And then we get Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne. So I know it's weird to maybe paint a whole family picture to get to Emily, but part of me doing that is to show you she's one in this big family in this very remote and gorgeous part of England. And over the years, she's losing beloved family members, one after the other. And so people who kind of immediately get into Wuthering Heights and want to talk about its darkness and its angst and its, pseudo-Gothic, Victorian Gothic vibes part of that is understanding like the landscape that she is brought up with and the people that she's brought up with and that sense of like pervasive loss. In addition to like painting the picture of her siblings, I do want to also talk about growing up in that household. Emily Bronte had a kind of upbringing that was really rare for women in the Victorian period, for little girls at this time. She's growing up in a space where intellectual voraciousness and learning and imagination and creativity and play were all things that were just allowed to run rampant. She was allowed to be herself creatively and individually. You know, we all know the other Bronte sisters as well. Like you have Charlotte, you have Anne, and you have Emily, all writing stories and creating these fictional worlds, right? Anne and Emily make the Gondel Saga, which is like this fantastic set of stories that they wrote all the way into their mid-20s, imagining fictional worlds with queens and heroes and heroines and adventure. And so Emily Bronte only lives until she's 30 years old, but that 30 years is just packed full of creativity and writing and adventure in the very small corner of the world that she got to adventure in. The only other thing I'll say about her that like I love in her biography, not only did she very famously love nature, but she was like the coolest girl ever to love nature. I know that doesn't sound very academic or professional, but she was like into falconry.
Mm.
She had like beloved dogs. At one of the schools that she taught at, she once told the students that she loved the dog, like the school dog, more than she liked the students. And like I think that there's something to be said about her kind of rebel spirit, and we see it in the
Mm.
one novel that, like, continues to live forever.
So talk us through Wuthering Heights. What are that book's central characters? What are its central concerns?
This book opens with a frame narrative, and we're in 1802. We open on the Yorkshire moors, and we have what is initially the central character, Mr. Lockwood. His landlord is Heathcliff, the, you know, beloved villain, ultimate Byronic bad boy. And initially, the way we get into the quote unquote romance at the core of the novel is actually through Lockwood staying the night at Wuthering Heights because he was stupid enough to get caught out in a storm. He goes to sleep in what was the bedroom of Catherine Linton, Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff. These are the names inscribed on the windowsill. And he has no idea who this is. And in his dreaming or waking, we're not sure, he hears the ghost of Catherine begging to be let in off the moors. He wakes in a fright. Heathcliff rushes, you know, to help this stranger staying in his home. And ultimately, the housekeeper, Nellie Dean, is going to tell us a ghost story. And that ghost story is the story of Catherine Earnshaw. So we flash back. We're probably back about like 40 years. We're in the 1760s. And here I kind of want to lay out the families because this is a novel about two estates and about two families and their interconnected histories and the romance and loss and vengeance and tragedy between these two families and these two places. So at Wuthering Heights, we have the Earnshaws. So it's Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw. We have their oldest son, Hindley, and we have their younger daughter, Catherine. We begin in the 1760s with Mr. Earnshaw coming home from a business trip to Liverpool. And he brings home, you know, this little described as like a street urchin. He's a black eyed, black haired little boy. He speaks gibberish. We don't know anything about his origin other than Mr. Earnshaw has brought him from the Liverpool streets. And this boy turns out to be Heathcliff. Our family unit now consists of, you know, three children, one who's kind of this adoptive ward figure. And from pretty much go, Catherine and Heathcliff are best friends. And this is the part of the novel where we, just like Emily, get to love the moors and get to love the natural world. everything that happens in the domestic sphere, all the kind of politics of propriety, all the economic problems that might be happening that we'll worry about later in the novel do not exist yet, because these are just children getting to be children, playing in nature, having imagination. It's a very romantic, in the capital R, romantic sense of the word. So they're getting older. We're in their teenage years. The parents, the Earnshaw parents have long since passed away now, and Hindley becomes the head of the household. And Hindley, unlike Catherine, not best friends with Heathcliff, hates Heathcliff, and really forces Heathcliff to be raised in this kind of degenerate state. He does not want him to be a brother figure. He does not want him to be a kind of legitimate member of the family. And so at this point in the novel, we have like the biggest turning point, which is the turning point between Catherine and Heathcliff getting to be like free children and best friends in nature, and Catherine realizing that she is a young woman who is expected to get married, and the politics of that. So there's a really important scene where Catherine and Heathcliff go to the Lintons' house, and here I'll introduce this family. They're spying in the window, and we see that we have the Linton parents, and again, we have a son and a daughter, Edgar and Isabella Linton. But Kathy and Heathcliff, these, wild, free children, are absolutely making fun of these soft-handed, very spoiled children who I believe are arguing over a puppy. But Catherine, unfortunately, gets caught by one of the dogs. They realize somebody's intruded onto the grounds. And this is one of the most pivotal scenes in the book, because it's the moment where the Lintons recognize, the legitimate daughter from the land owning family next door, take her inside to make sure she's taken care of, and alternatively look at young Heathcliff, call him a Lascar, so racial connotations, and saying, he's an outsider, he's an other, what's that stable boy doing here? They send him back to Wuthering Heights, they take Catherine inside. So from this point in the novel, this is kind of like the division between our two main characters that is gonna lead to all of the drama to come. And this is the drama that I think people just are most fascinated about when we talk about this novel. Catherine ultimately agrees to marry Edgar Linton, despite having proclaimed that, of course, she loves Heathcliff, right? It's not just that there's like a lowercase r romance. For Emily Brontë, it's much bigger than that, and it always has been. And I think this gets lost in translation, where they're soulmates, right? She says, like, the stuff that his soul is made of, like, mine is too. I am Heathcliff. All of the most iconic lines come from this scene where Catherine is saying, yes, I'm going to marry Edgar, but that doesn't mean that Heathcliff isn't literally my other half. So when that agreement happens, Heathcliff very dramatically runs away. 3 years, I think, about pass. But when he returns absolutely loaded. This is the part of the novel where things get even more complicated. To put it quickly, this is where the revenge plot starts. Heathcliff can't have Catherine. She's married. But what Heathcliff can do is go down this road of vengeance for all of the things he can't have. And he eventually runs away with Isabella Linton. And so we truly have the most entangled, I don't want to even say love triangles, but it's two families with entangled romantic connections where nobody is really getting what they want, but everybody is getting something. Catherine, I mean, to put it mildly but accurately, kind of falls into a fit of madness, really just disintegrating and ultimately dying. She gives birth to a daughter and very, very quickly after that dies. This is the point where most people shut the novel if they want to make an adaptation, and yet it is very much not the end of the story. But this next part of the novel is the real fruition of Heathcliff's revenge. By the end of the novel, we are caught up to this second generation. And back in our quote unquote present, we kind of have these two holdouts trying to find happiness, and Heathcliff being the ultimate barrier to having a kind of normal life. So once Heathcliff does die, we get this sense that these two characters are the future. We don't just have this tragic love story, we also have like a sense of futurity by the end of the novel.
It's a fantastic summary. It's a fantastically difficult novel to summarize. Emily's sister, Charlotte, wrote Jane Eyre, which is a beautifully straightforward three-act story, and teachers love to teach Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights is so much harder to teach for all the reasons that you've outlined. That frame narrative, that constant flashing back and forth between different time periods, the fact that there are so many characters whose names sound similar or actually even are the same.
I feel
Um,
like I was being tested, but by a very good friend, so it's okay.
Well, one thing that I think comes across really clearly and effectively in your summary is the importance of Heathcliff, whose name must be on every single page of this novel. I don't know this for certain, but I'm sure that it comes up almost more than any other single word in the book. Heathcliff looms large in the cultural imagination. He has been Laurence Olivier, he has been Jacob Elordi. There's a lot of him in J.K. Rowling's Severus Snape. But one thing that often gets overlooked about Heathcliff is his race, even though this is incredibly central to Bronte's narrative. You mentioned that when he's first brought back from Liverpool, he has dark hair, he has dark eyes, he's said to be speaking gibberish, and throughout the novel, characters are sort of referring to him using either racialized language or outright racist language. So, can you talk us through Heathcliff's race and what it's doing in Bronte's original novel?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start again with that date at the opening of the novel. So we open in 1802. And again, this is something a lot of scholars have focused on because there seems to be a lot of intentionality behind that date preceding the end of the slave trade and Liverpool being the place that Mr. Earnshaw is doing business in. Liverpool is the largest slave trade port in Britain. So just immediately, like people kind of reading the bigger world system in which this novel takes place, you see those two things and your eyebrows go up, right? And so from the go, we get this sense that there's a historical connection to the Atlantic slave trade. And that's why so many critics do go straight to not just the politics of race, but the politics of this being a young Black child in the historical context of slavery and in the historical context of knowing that the Brontes as a family and the father, Reverend Bronte, was a passionate abolitionist. So it's not a stretch by any means. People who think you might be reading race into the novel, no, it's on the first page. I will say though, in addition to that, there is a lot of ambiguity after that moment. It's like if we kind of left it there, I think you would read this as Heathcliff being, a young Black or mixed race child. But the kind of ambiguity that gets layered onto him throughout the novel is really interesting, right? He's a heathen, a Lascar, the son of a Chinese king or an Indian queen. Like he is both not white, but could be anything in the British system in this globalizing moment. And so I think that this, for me, is a really fascinating way to have one character embody so many different global connections, and not just global connections between Britain and the rest of the world, but the moral villainy of like the role that Britain was playing in the world system at this time. And so it's a lot for one character to carry, but he carries those racial politics throughout the novel. And they're important to our reading of the novel. It's not just that he's a person of color, it inflects how we read everything in this novel. Like, so when I talk about Heathcliff and Kathy being free on the moors and having this kind of soulmate level connection, that's incredibly political. to say that this young landowning daughter of a very old British family is the soulmate to this young person of color implicated potentially in the British slave trade, right? So when people don't talk about the question of race in this novel, they're taking away a lot of the politics of it, which I think is both a disservice to the book, but also a disservice to Bronte, and how tuned in she was to these incredibly important historical questions.
Yeah, and alongside Heathcliff's race and his status as a persecuted and yet simultaneously persecuting minority figure, is that really vexed relationship at the center of the novel between him and Kathy. What are the gender politics of this novel like?
The freedom that young Catherine has on the moors is in very sharp contradistinction to the domestic space. This is one of the most iconic settings in all of literature, not just British literature. And for me, the first way that it's iconic is absolutely connected to gender. Her getting to like run wild and ride horses and learn all of the feathers of all of the birds in the region, it's something that once she grows into a woman on the marriage market and becomes a commodity herself, she won't get to have access to. And so celebrating and really luxuriating in that part of her life and her connection to the natural world is integral to understanding the kind of gender commentary of this novel. In addition to gender, I also want to talk about the politics of desire because this is the part of the book that I really think invites readers to have different takes. And I love that about this novel. I don't think there's one way to read into the passion and the longing in this novel. So what I mean by that is, I mean, to put it bluntly, like as far as we are concerned as readers, this is a sexless novel for Heathcliff and Catherine as a pair. They both have children, so we know that happens, but they have it with other people. And so the romance at the heart of it is all about longing. And it's all about longing that because of all of the social laws of propriety, it doesn't get to be satisfied. And that to me is one of the biggest dramas of the novel. What are the racial politics that keep that passion from being allowed to become a romantic relationship? What are the gender and class politics that keep that from being able to happen? So the reason I say that people can kind of read into that differently is let's take another step back and remember that this is a frame narrative and that we're not getting this story from Catherine. We're not getting this story from Heathcliff. We're getting this story from Nellie Dean. So we're getting this story from a woman who, as the housekeeper of both of these estates, has witnessed the relationship between these two people from childhood until Catherine's death, but has only witnessed it from the extent that she can as an outsider to that relationship. So if you are a reader who wants to read into subtext or put kind of your fantasies on this part of the novel, I do think you can. However, in terms of what is manifest in the text, it is so much about not getting to have that certain kind of happiness, not getting to have those passions brought to light. And I also do want to say one more thing about this, which is I think that in the same way the novel uses the natural world to subvert gender politics, to subvert racial politics, it also aligns some of these passionate desires with the natural world. So, like, the natural world is a space where maybe you are a desiring subject. It is the domestic space, it is the estate, it is the marriage market that says you cannot be that unless it works with the laws of propriety. That's why Catherine has to marry an Edgar Linton and could never marry a Heathcliff.
I want to go back to what you said about readers projecting their fantasies onto this book. I think that's
Yeah.
really interesting. And I think it's interesting, especially in light of the fact that a lot of young readers, very young readers, tend to encounter Wuthering Heights at a formative age. And a lot of times that's the same age when they're encountering something like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So, How do you think that tends to inflect people's understanding of this novel? The fact that it's often introduced in the context of, a romance with Mr. Darcy and a romance with Mr. Heathcliff.
It's funny because your question is me. Like that I am that child. I am that 12-year-old who read Pride and Prejudice and then immediately after read Wuthering Heights. And what's funny is for me, and then maybe I'll speak to a broader audience if I can, I remember Wuthering Heights being hard. Like, I have enough humility to say that I read Pride and Prejudice, and I'm not saying Jane Austen is not a brilliant or difficult author, but I understood the romance. I got to Wuthering Heights, and I was like, "What is this?" Like, it's a completely different animal, and I think that it's easy to know that when, you're in your 20s and 30s and have lived a little, but when you are, like, 12 and just learning like what romance is, you don't really know what you're looking at. And I think that one of the dangers, I'll say, of like conflating, a Pride and Prejudice romance with Wuthering Heights is Wuthering Heights is like full of violence and abuse and it's about love, but it is about what love can do to you when it is not a perfect, positive, pure, sugar-coated love. It's a book about obsession, and that obsession can be incredibly romantic. Like, we all kind of, "Oh, like, I want someone to love me so much that they're obsessed with me." it sounds unhealthy saying that out loud, but we identify with stories where there's longing. But Wuthering Heights is a book where that obsession turns people bad, like, actively bad. And I think that young readers reading that might not fully understand kind of the weight that it's not just a love story, it's a story about obsession. And what is the difference between those two things?
So, as we pivot here in the second half of our interview toward adaptations of Wuthering Heights, I want to pause just for a moment and ask, how have scholars typically understood adaptation across different media? What are the challenges? What are the goals? And then how do you understand adaptation? What does a good adaptation do in your point of view?
Adaptation is a creative process. Like, let's say that you are setting out to make what is in your mind the most accurate, true to the novel adaptation of Wuthering Heights absolutely possible. It is still a creative process. It's a creative process for a handful of reasons, the most obvious of which is you are translating mediums. So there's the first question if we're talking about a book to film adaptation. Well, what can film do that the novel can't, right? If we want to take a silver linings approach, like what is the visual aspect of film going to do for the Yorkshire Moors that maybe the prose of Emily Bronte doesn't do directly? The other side of that coin is what does the affordance of a 400-page novel allow you to do that, let's say, a 2-hour film is gonna make incredibly difficult? And how are you gonna tackle those difficulties? And those questions come whether you wanna make a really true to text adaptation or whether you're a director that's trying to take a big creative swing and are actively approaching adaptation as is a hugely creative process. I think it comes down to what is the goal of your creative process? Is the goal that there's some kernel of truth from this story that you want to explore? And how are you going to do that? Or is the goal like you think the entire plot from start to finish is perfect and you want to deliver what is more akin to a translation to screen? I think determining what that goal is, as long as the piece can stand alone and can stand alone well as a work of art, I think it's a pretty good adaptation.
It's a great answer, and it reminds me of an article by the film theorist Andre Bazin. I think it's called like Cinema as Digest or something like that.
Mm.
He talks about how there's no real way to put the full experience of a novel on screen. But he emphasizes that style is not the same thing as grammar. And what a good director will be able to do is find visual equivalents for verbal phrases. So let's take a look at one particular adaptation of Wuthering Heights. This is the German American film director William Wyler's 1939 film adaptation, starring Merle Oberon as Catherine and Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff. How does Wyler's version reimagine Bronte's novel?
Oh, it's just Hollywood melodrama. I mean, Wuthering Heights is a dramatic novel. There's no arguing about the drama in this novel. But that is saying something different than golden age of Hollywood melodrama. If you even just press play on this 1939 film and listen to the first 10 seconds, you already know how the film is being imagined. And it is gentle, whimsical music that is a love story. And then very quickly, it is big doom and gloom. Tragedy is coming. So it's star-crossed lovers. It's love leading to a tragic ending. It's a lot of fidelity to parts of the novel that it chooses as a through line and does carry them out, but cuts a lot of other things. So, for example, I think that you can describe the Wyler film as a story about class, is a distinct story about two differently classed individuals who cannot be together because of class. It edits out the gender politics, it edits out the racial politics. But I don't just want to rip apart things that frustrated me, a lot of the kind of defanging of the novel,
Mhm.
but I wanna give credit to something that I think this adaptation does well, is there seemed to me to be a lot of focus on script and story and kind of keeping the plot really connected in a way that not all adaptations choose to do quite so carefully. That being said, I had a hard time with the whitewashing of the story, and I had a hard time with the portrayal of Catherine. And I think that Merle Oberon's an amazing actress. It's not the acting. I actually was very impressed by a lot of the acting in this film. It was the decision to make her from childhood into someone dreaming about an easier life
Mm.
in the sense of class. When they're children going out on the moor, yes, we get that important sense of freedom and imagination, but she's like playing prince and princess. And she's like thinking about clothing, which is fine, but she's thinking about the material world from a very young age in a way that felt really not just disingenuous to the original text. I don't think you have to be perfectly aligned with the original text to make a good adaptation, but in a way that felt disingenuous to something that I think makes Catherine Earnshaw a fascinating character,
Mm.
which is that she is a rebel. And taking that out of that character, not in every way, but in a lot of ways, was the thing that as a viewer hurt me the most,
Mm.
as part of my viewing experience of the film.
So you've used this term melodrama a couple of different times, Hollywood melodrama. Can you actually just slow down for a moment and unpack what that means? Like, what is a Hollywood melodrama, and how might that term connect back to the Victorian era?
Well, at its most basic form, mellow and drama is the combination of music with the dramatic arts. But to put it more in the context of classic Hollywood melodrama, it's a focus on emotion, like intense emotions. You have really clear moral contrasts. Like you know who the good guy is and you know who the bad guy is. You have a very sensational plot. Like this is where like the kind of star-crossed lovers trope is perfect for a melodrama. In a love triangle is perfect for a melodrama because you kind of have like the partners who maybe are supposed to end up together and then you have like the one making that relationship difficult. So intense emotion, high dramatic stakes, sensational plot. Like you said, this is actually a connection generically between Hollywood and the Victorian era because we do have melodrama coming out of the 19th century. But there's something really historically distinct about a 1939 film in America under the Hays Code which says, like, "Thou shalt not disparage the morals of your audience," might be different than the Victorian melodrama.
Yeah, I think maybe one way to approach this could be you said that melodramas, both in Hollywood and the 19th century, really clearly signal who's good and who's bad. And first of all, that's something that Bronte's novel doesn't really do. As
Right.
bad as Heathcliff is, we can't stop reading about him. He is the engine of the story. We want to go back to him, and a lot of people clearly do fall in love with him, both in the fictional world and in the real world. There are people who want to date Heathcliff. He's a monster boyfriend, right? Um, the melodrama tends to iron out that kind of complexity. But I think one of the things that distinguishes the Hollywood melodrama from the Victorian melodrama is in the Victorian version there is a villain, very, very clearly, and that villain is allowed to be bad. And when I watch this Wyler film, I don't really think there is a clear villain. I mean,
Mm,
how bad is Heathcliff really in this film? You know,
that's such a good point.
he's Laurence Olivier, so he's sort of this dashing Shakespearean stage actor, and, he occasionally does kind of mean things, but in the book, Heathcliff is, like, hanging puppies, he's abusing women. In the movie, I can't I mean, I'm sure Laurence Olivier does something bad as Heathcliff, but I can't really remember anything except him, like, standing on top of the crags, soliloquizing to the sky. That's my primary impression of this film. So maybe that reluctance to allow real villainy on screen is, I think, distinct from the Victorians' willingness to allow real villainy on stage, as long as it gets punished at the end.
I couldn't agree more. The the sauciest thing that Olivier Heathcliff does is some yelling. And I also think it's probably a real question for people adapting this book. How bad can you make Heathcliff and still have him be a romantic lead? How bad can you make him in eras of censorship? How bad can you make him and still have people buy a ticket to your movie?
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Um, One thing that strikes me about this movie is that it's adapting Bronte's story not just across different media, so from book to screen, but also across different genres. Because it seems to me that Bronte's book is not a melodrama. And it seems to me that in the 19th century, people understood that it was not a melodrama. Within 1 month of Jane Eyre's publication, people have adapted it for the stage as a melodrama. Before Oliver Twist was even done being serialized, people were adapting Oliver Twist to the stage as a melodrama. To my knowledge, there's not a single Victorian melodramatic adaptation of Wuthering Heights, and I think that really speaks volumes about what its contemporaries thought of it, what it could do and what it couldn't do. But let's talk about the most recent adaptation of Wuthering Heights, a controversial adaptation, and an adaptation whose title was originally in quotation marks as Wuthering Heights. This is Emerald Fennell's 2026 film with Margot Robbie as Catherine and Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. Talk us through this one. What is it doing differently from Bronte's novel and from earlier adaptations?
Okay. I want to start by saying I love a movie that takes a big swing. That being said, I want to say that something that this adaptation is doing differently is instead of prioritizing kind of the complexity of plot, it is prioritizing vibes, which could be fascinating. So I look, Emerald Fennell has even come out and said, like, I've put the film in quotation marks because it's not a direct adaptation. There's no desire for this to be like a perfect page to screen adaptation. And again, I don't think adaptations need to be. However, what it is it's kind of like an impressionist rendering of what it is like to be maybe a teenage girl reading Wuthering Heights, having those fantasies about the romance that aren't or maybe can't be depicted on the page of a Victorian novel. And then growing up and coming to the year 2026 being like, what can I make out of that artistic fever dream? That is that kind of impressionistic understanding of this book and what it has left with her or with some of us as readers. So I think that this is still an adaptation, whether she wants it to be or not, but it's an adaptation based on impression of the feeling of a novel and not necessarily the content of that novel. And again, I'm not going to defend, all of the creative choices made in this film, and I think we should get into like specifically some of those creative decisions. But I do think it's an interesting choice to focus on the feeling that a piece of art gives you instead of focusing on the piece of art. And I can imagine a world in which the outcome of that could have been really successful. I personally don't think it was here because when you take a work like Wuthering Heights, not just that it's so beloved, but because it is so good. Like you do have so much material to work with and a lot of material to parse through if you don't want to keep it all. You can take the best pieces of it and still go for vibe and still go for style and still explore that kind of sexy impression that the book left upon you when you were young. So, I mean, I would love to hear your 2 cents, but I think my biggest takeaway is I actually thought there was a ton of potential in the approach to this adaptation, and I think it just didn't come out the way it might have.
Let's talk about a couple things in particular that people
Yeah.
didn't love about this adaptation. Number one is something that it actually shares in common with the Wyler version, and that is it cuts the second half of the novel altogether. So, what is the effect of that decision? Why do so many adaptations insist on just getting rid of 200 pages of Bronte's book?
Yeah, look, from a, like, economical point of view of somebody taking a 400-page Victorian novel and making a film, I understand, like, the instinct to, like, "Let's just get to the heart of this. Let's get to this juicy plot in the middle that everybody loves, and let's cut the frame narrative." However, the thing that happens when you do that is you miss one of my favorite aspects of this novel, which is that it's a ghost story. Like if you are somebody who's kind of obsessed with the neo-Gothic vibe of this work, how are you not leaning into the fact that Catherine Earnshaw is such a haunting figure that she's not only haunting the audience, she's literally been haunting generations of people listening to her story, learning this tragedy, that her tragic end lives forever. The frame narrative gives us the Gothic in a way that I think Fennell tries to capture in setting, in choices about some of the cinematography. Like you do really get, for lack of a better phrase, like the dark vibes
Mhm.
of a Gothic novel, but you get the dark vibes without like the structure that helps those vibes have something a little more substantial to rest on,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I think one of my main problems with this film, which is doing interesting things, but is that so much of it feels so hollow, and it doesn't have stakes. And I think a lot of its seeming purposelessness comes from the fact that if you don't have Kathy haunting the moors, the novel's future is kind of absent, and all the
Mhm.
characters just seem to be living in the present. I mean, the book is so invested in the way that abuse and trauma are inherited and the way that they are perpetuated, into indefinite futurity. You don't get any of that really in Fennell's piece.
One of the reasons that I think Wuthering Heights, like, endures again, there's a handful of reasons, but one of the things that sits with me as a reader is this romance plot at the core of the book between 2 teenagers, it's a moment in time.
Mm.
Like, if we really boil down, like, the significance of time in this novel, you have a story of lost connection that happens between 2 people by the age of 18, and then that story is over. And so what the frame narrative gives us and what Emily Bronte's capital R romanticism gives us by saying, "My love for Heathcliff is like the stones," and all of these things, is that what might seem like the most insignificant little blips of human existence are actually eternal if we can make them
Mm.
eternal. And that's what art does, but that's also like something that the frame narrative sets us up to do as consumers of this story. It reminds us, yes, this might have just been a moment in time between 2 people in an incredibly isolated space that no one in the world would ever know about. Like, we are insignificant creatures. But oh my gosh, the significance that this had for those people and for the people who came after them. And now for literally hundreds of years of people who've read this story, like, it's a novel about love and tragedy and obsession, but it's also a novel that shows us what novels can do,
Yeah.
which is make the most insignificant parts of our experience incredibly significant.
Yeah, that's really powerfully said. It's ironic that Fennell's adaptation kind of misses the poignancy and the potency of moments, because in one
Mm,
perspective, it's really invested in individual moments, to the point where it sometimes feels a little bit like scrolling TikTok. When I'm watching the Fennell film, I get so frustrated because it feels to me like every single scene is doing the exact same thing. I mean, how many times can you count Jacob Elordi saying like "I love you, Kathy," and then Margot Robbie saying "You can't love me, Heathcliff"? It's every single scene. But another thing people don't like about this adaptation or have questioned about this adaptation is Jacob Elordi. So let's talk about
mm.
Jacob Elordi again, and let's talk about the way in which Heathcliff, just like in the 1939 version, is whitewashed. Why might this have been the case, do you think? And what are the effects that it has on the film as a work of art?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the casting, and let's start with Heathcliff. For starters, my commentary on the 1939 holds of what gets lost when we whitewash this character, but I want to note, I didn't know this till recently. The film was done with racially blind casting except for the leads. And so that's why we get like Asian Nellie Dean, who I will say again, a sparkling part of the film for me. I thought her performance was great.
Yeah, she's really good.
And we also have an actor of Indian descent playing Edgar Linton. So, like, it was interesting to me that they opened the film to this style of casting, but for the character that we lose meaning if you don't kind of cast them within this bigger historical context, that's where they chose to cast Jacob Elordi. So, I mean, I have to conjecture that a few things are happening here. One, he's a superstar, right? Like he's hot right now, like people like him. He's a big star. The other thing that I've heard, in the grapevine of social media is that he's like the romantic cover, like novel covers that Fennell kind of imagined. Again, that kind of palimpsestic reading of a book when you're like, I'm gonna put my fantasy over the book and I'm gonna read these two things together like a palimpsest. And again, I get that. Like, I'm like not actually completely against that. I think that when it comes to adaptations, you mentioned this before, we're not just watching a Wuthering Heights that is based on a fever dream of the novel. It's the Wuthering Heights coming also after this 1939 version, coming after quite a handful of versions over the last few decades. And so this idea that we have this big pool, not just of versions of this story and all the accoutrement that goes with that, whether it's a cover with like a brawny white guy with kind of like scraggly caveman hair, whatever it is. I understand that your reading of something comes from the context in which you read it. That does not mean that there couldn't have been somebody assisting in the production of this film that could have had a really substantive conversation around what gets lost when we don't have a person of color playing Heathcliff. Oh, and Margot Robbie. Okay. This is where I emphasize that look, I'm a literature professor who teaches in a gender and sexuality studies department. And so what I'm about to say about age, I want in no way to come off as ageist. And I'm gonna say it to both leads of the film. And that I think you can tell by some of the commentary I've given that something that is important about this book is the youthfulness of its characters. And I have yet to have an adaptation do a version of Catherine that I'm fully happy with, and that's on me. But so one of the issues that I had with this adaptation is Catherine Earnshaw can absolutely be a brat. She does come off as a bit of a brat in the book at times. She also comes off as a rebel and incredibly smart and sassy, and she's a very complicated teenage girl. Anyone who's ever met a teenage girl or has been a teenage girl knows that they are complicated. It was a little odd watching a 35-year-old woman play pretty accurately for bits that kind of brattiness. There was a dissonance there where it's like you knew that Robbie understood the assignment. She's like, there is this kind of quality to Catherine Earnshaw, but there was something about adults, like full-on adults, playing that part of the angsty youthfulness that from the beginning kind of struck a weird note for me. So I also share this complaint with the 1939 film. My understanding is both of those actors were late 20s, early 30s at the time of filming. So this is Hollywood, and maybe I can just blame Hollywood. But at the same time, it it confuses a complicated character and makes for, I think, a very difficult task for Margot Robbie to undertake.
Yeah. And maybe the last thing to talk about here would be the film's kind of performative sexiness, for lack of a better term, because I know that a lot of viewers responded to this either really positively or really negatively. But how does that relate to the book?
I think that enough has been said about the decision to transform Wuthering Heights into a bodice ripper. And again, it's actually not my biggest complaint with the film. Like, I can imagine doing something creative with this book where you really, really unpack that central theme of longing and desire. I think that something that this movie does with that longing and desire is it trades the idea of really deep spiritual connection. That sounds maybe a little hokey, but like truly, like they are, whatever his soul of, mine is made of the same stuff. It trades emphasizing that for a kind of disingenuous sexiness that somebody who is an avid reader and watcher of all things that include sexiness, wasn't convinced by. And it's not just that it was a proliferation of like incredibly clothed sex, which I found an interesting choice in a movie that I do think was rated R.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that's the main actor's decisions. I don't know what all goes into that, but to have that a trade was made between having the kind of what is a deeply sexy longing that is absolutely part of this story and trading that energy for satisfied longing, but satisfied longing that still was somehow really unsexy. I think somehow as a viewer, I do have a hard time explaining why I found it not sexy. And it wasn't even some of the creative swings of like using the natural world to symbolize sex. I was kind of fascinated by like the egg yolk and the snails having trails on the windows. I think some people were probably like, what the heck am I watching? And I think Fennell's strength in this film was in the details. I think where the film lost it for me was in their connectivity. If those details in the creative vision had actually matched up with a script that really got across that deep sense of love and being a soulmate and being tortured, and that sex might be a part of that but was not the only part of that, I think I would have been a happy viewer.
So do you have, as we wrap up here, an ideal fan cast for your adaptation of Wuthering Heights?
Okay. Part of this answer is going to seem like a cop out, but I'm going to stand by it. I don't have a fan cast, but what I would want is two young unknowns. I think that is what would make me happiest. And this is maybe a wild comparison to make to a film like this, but I can remember being in college when The Hunger Games was being
Hmm.
cast. And we were all, all the book nerds following the casting news. And the cast is announced, and we're like, who? Like, who are these people? And like Jennifer Lawrence she'd done Winter's Bone at that point. So it's like she'd been in one thing, huge critical acclaim, but the acclaim was around her acting skills. It wasn't, so that's to say, like, I could imagine a world where we treated Wuthering Heights almost more like that, where it's something that we did some race-blind casting, I think I would choose, and just have a cast of such talented actors that you aren't casting based on the marquee.
Mm.
You are casting based on who is possibly gonna be able to carry these incredibly complicated roles.
And lastly today, why do you feel that Wuthering Heights is still worth retelling today?
I think that part of why Wuthering Heights persists is twofold. One is the same reason that we still love period pieces in general. And it is that there is something about having a time and place to be transported to as a viewer or a reader, and have that time and place be something that I can only describe as poetic. Like you feel like you're in a different world, but it is reality. It is just not your reality.
Mm.
And I think that for any kid and any teenage person who grew up with reading as a really important escape in your life, man, to escape to the moors. Like you can't choose a more iconic place that is quite literally, in the novel, a place of escapism. So part of it for me is that. The other part is the very core of the novel that is its most enduring and its most dangerous. And that is, we love a love story, and we love a love story that tells us about the best and worst of us. I think there's absolutely a market for very clean-cut love stories. I love a rom-com, right? Like, there's a genre for that. That's not Wuthering Heights. I say the royal we, but, we also want love stories that help us reflect on why love is the thing that both brings people together and why it is the thing that can make us feel absolutely torn to shreds. And there is something about this novel that even hundreds of years later helps us work through that. Whether you're in a happy relationship or whether you're going through a breakup, like no matter what level of love you are in your life, Wuthering Heights has something to tell you about the mess, the beauty and the tragedy that is loving as a human being.
Kristin, thank you so much for coming on our show today.
I'm so happy to have gotten to talk with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Dr. Kristin Rose recently published articles titled Post-Extraction Possibility, Genre and Landscape in George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss, and Horror in the Court, Epistemological Collision and Frankenstein's Serial Killer. You can find links to her work in the show notes and on this episode's webpage at meltingintoair.net. Melting Into Air's second season, Blood and Fire, will premiere in fall 2026. Heathcliff's parents may have come from China, India, Ireland, or the regions devastated by Atlantic slavery. We'll visit all these places, and many more, in Season 2's investigation of the British Empire in the early 19th century. Our debut episode, A Man and a Brother, will analyze Britain's participation in the slave trade and explore why Parliament declared that trade illegal in 1807. If you're eager for more content before that episode drops, you can check out our show's Patreon, where we've posted some bonus material from this interview with Kristin, and a special Season 1 Q&A episode featuring responses to your questions. I'm Brian Rankin. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting Into Air.